The dropship shuddered as it touched down on the cracked landing pad of Verath 4, and Sergeant Elias Cade stepped out into air that smelled like sulfur and burnt metal. The kind of air that told a soldier everything he needed to know about the world he had just arrived on. He carried 2 duffel bags, one over each shoulder, and wore armor that looked like it had survived more wars than most of the aliens on this moon had ever read about in their history files, scratched, dented, patched in a dozen places with mismatched plates, and still holding strong after 15 years of service. The forward operating base of the Galactic Coalition spread out before him like a small city made of light and glass. Elegant curved structures, hovering supply drones, and soldiers from a dozen different species, moving with the calm precision of professionals who had never truly been afraid of losing a war. Cade was one of 3 humans assigned to the mission, and from the moment he walked through the base gates, he could feel the eyes on him, not hostile exactly, but curious in the way that someone might look at a strange animal that had somehow wandered into a place it did not belong. Humanity was still a provisional member of the coalition, a polite way of saying that nobody really trusted them yet, and nobody really expected much from them. They were a young species from a violent little planet, and most of the galaxy treated them like children who had been allowed to sit at the adults' table for the first time. He reported to Fireteam Kesh at the Eastern Barracks, where Commander Thyron was waiting for him with arms folded, and a face that said everything his words did not. Thyron was a Lori, tall, lean, covered in fine silver-blue scales that caught the light like polished metal, and he looked at Cade the way a master craftsman might look at a dull tool that had been forced into his kit. "Sergeant Cade," Thyron said, his voice smooth and cool, "you are the human attachment to my fire team. I expect you to follow orders, stay in formation, and try not to slow us down." "Understood, Commander," Cade replied, and that was all he said. The rest of Fireteam Kesh stood behind Thyron in a loose line. Druck, a massive Gorvon heavy gunner who stood nearly 8 feet tall with gray-green skin like cracked stone and arms thick enough to crush a ground vehicle. Viz, a Selith scout, small and quick with enormous dark eyes and 4 arms that moved with unsettling speed. And Nava, an Elori medic who shared Thyron's elegant features but carried something softer in her gaze, something that looked almost like curiosity. Druck gave Cade a slow look from head to toe, and let out a low rumble that might have been a laugh. "Small," Druck said, "even for a human." Cade did not respond. He simply set his bags down and waited for the weapons inspection. It came an hour later, conducted in the main staging tent under bright white lights, while officers from other fire teams wandered through to check their own equipment. Plasma lances humming with contained energy, particle beamers gleaming like works of art, personal shield generators no bigger than a fist that could stop a bolt of superheated gas at 30 meters. Cade opened his first duffel and laid out his gear, a standard sidearm that drew no attention, a set of demolition charges that drew mild approval, and then a weapon that made every alien in a 10-meter radius stop what they were doing and stare. It was a rifle, a long, heavy, ugly thing made of dark metal and polymer stock, with a manual bolt action and a magazine that fed brass-cased cartridges filled with chemical propellant and capped with shaped lead-in tungsten projectiles. It was a ballistic weapon, a slug thrower, the kind of thing the Coalition had stopped using more than 1,000 years ago. Thyron stared at it, as if Cade had placed a dead animal on the table. "What," Thyron said slowly, "is that?" "M40A7 bolt-action rifle," Cade said, "chambered in 7.62 by 51 millimeter, effective range about 1,000 meters, sometimes more with the right ammunition." "It uses chemical propellant," Viz said, leaning closer with all 4 arms tucked behind her back, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. "It literally sets off a small explosion to push a piece of metal through a tube." "That is correct," Cade said. Druck burst out laughing, a deep, booming sound that turned heads across the entire tent, A fire stick. The human brought a fire stick to a galactic war. He slapped his knee with a hand the size of a dinner plate and shook his head, still rumbling with laughter. Did you also bring a sharp rock, human? Maybe a pointed stick? Verath smiled, a thin, quick expression that was more pity than cruelty. I have seen these in museums on the Central Worlds. They are displayed next to stone axes and wooden shields. Thyron's jaw tightened and he looked at Cade with something close to genuine anger. Sergeant, this force is deploying against the Vraxi swarm, 40,000 drones, minimum, and you have brought a weapon that belongs in a display case. It works, Cade said quietly. So does a rock if you throw it hard enough, Thyron replied, but I would not bring one to war. Cade said nothing more. He simply picked up the rifle, broke it down into its component parts with hands that moved with the kind of speed and certainty that only comes from doing something 10,000 times, cleaned each piece with a worn cloth, oiled the bolt, checked the barrel, and reassembled the entire weapon in under 90 seconds. Then he set it down, picked up his bags, and walked to his assigned bunk without another word. The tent buzzed with conversation after he left, laughter mostly, and a few shaking heads, and the general agreement that the human was either stubborn or stupid or both, and that it was a good thing he was only one soldier in a force of 600, because he certainly was not going to make a difference with that ancient piece of junk. But Nava did not laugh. She stood at the edge of the tent and watched Cade walk away, and she noticed something that none of the others had bothered to see: the way he moved, the way his eyes swept every doorway and rooftop and shadow without his head ever turning, the way his hands never stopped working even when his face showed nothing at all. She had studied human biology during her medic training. She knew about their planet, their gravity, their history, and she knew something that most of the Coalition preferred to forget, which was that humans had not earned their place among the stars by being peaceful or elegant or advanced. They had earned it by being the single most dangerous predator their world had ever produced, and their world had produced a lot of dangerous things. That night, the mission briefing confirmed what everyone already feared. The Vraxi had dug into the colony with over 40,000 drones, possibly more, and they were breeding fast in the underground tunnels beneath the settlement. The strike force numbered 600. Coalition standard doctrine said that was more than enough, because Coalition weapons were precise and powerful, and the soldiers who carried them were well trained. Thyron laid out the assault plan with crisp efficiency and asked if there were any questions. From the back of the room, Cade raised his hand not high, not demanding, just enough to be seen. Thyron sighed, "Yes, Sergeant." "What is the terrain like at the choke points?" Cade asked. The room went quiet for a moment. It was a good question, a surprisingly good question, and Thyron answered it with a detailed topographic display before moving on. But Nava noticed that Cade did not look at the display the way the others did. He did not look at where to attack. He looked at where to defend. And that told her something that made the scales on the back of her neck stand up, because it meant the human was not planning for victory. He was planning for what happens when everything goes wrong. The Coalition dropship Resolute Wind cut through the black silence of space on a 48-hour transit to the colony world, and within the first 3 hours, every soldier on board knew about the human with the ancient rifle. They came to see it the way people visit a curiosity, groups of 2 or 3 wandering past Fireteam Kesh's section of the barracks deck, slowing their steps just enough to catch a glimpse of the weapon hanging on the rack beside Cade's bunk. Whispering to each other in languages he could not understand but tones he understood perfectly well. It was a joke to them, a funny story to break the tension before a real fight, and Cade let them look because it cost him nothing, and their laughter told him something useful about how they thought. On the second day, a Gorvan sergeant named Hall came to the barracks with a grin wide enough to split his heavy jaw, and a voice loud enough to fill the corridor. "Human," Hall announced, planting himself in front of Cade's bunk like a boulder that had decided to grow legs. "I hear you think that toy of yours is a weapon. I say we settle this like soldiers, you and me. Simulation pod, best shooter wins." A crowd had already gathered behind Hall, soldiers from half a dozen species, all grinning, all waiting for the show. Cade looked up from the ammunition he was sorting and studied Hall for a long moment. Then he stood and said one word. "Fine." The simulation pods were on the lower deck, enclosed chambers that projected realistic combat environments and scored accuracy, reaction time, and kill efficiency in real time on a display screen visible to anyone watching from outside. Hall went first. He selected his standard-issue plasma lance, a sleek weapon that hummed with contained energy, and stepped into a scenario featuring stationary and slow-moving targets at various ranges. He was good, genuinely good. Every shot landed clean and bright, burning precise holes through the center of each target, and his accuracy score climbed steadily into the high 90s, while the watching soldiers cheered and banged their fists against the walls in approval. When Hall finished, his score glowed on the screen like a trophy: 96% accuracy, 14 seconds average acquisition time, near-perfect marks across the board. He stepped out of the pod with his arms spread wide and looked at Cade with the satisfied expression of someone who had already won. "Your turn, Firestick," Hall said. Cade stepped into the pod without a word, loaded his rifle, and waited for the scenario to begin. The first rounds were the same, stationary and slow-moving targets, and Cade's scores were good but not spectacular, not enough to match Hall's precision with a weapon that fired bolts of plasma at the speed of light. The crowd murmured with amusement. This was going exactly as everyone expected. Then the scenario shifted. The simulation changed to a wave assault environment, hundreds of fast-moving targets pouring through a narrow corridor, rushing toward the shooter in a tide of simulated bodies, and the scoring system shifted from pure accuracy to kill efficiency, measuring how many targets were eliminated in the shortest time. Hall's run on this scenario had been impressive, disciplined single shots, each one carefully aimed, each one burning through one target at a time with clean precision. Cade did something different. He did not aim at individual targets. He fired through clusters, placing each heavy round where the bodies were thickest, and the tungsten-tipped slugs punched through the first target and kept going, ripping through the second and sometimes the third before they stopped. The kill counter on the display screen began to climb fast, then faster, then so fast that the numbers blurred, and by the time the scenario ended, Cade's kill efficiency score was nearly triple Hall's. The corridor outside the pod went silent. Hall stared at the screen for a long moment, then let out a forced laugh and shook his head. "Simulations are not real combat," he said, and several soldiers nodded in agreement, and the crowd broke apart with the uneasy energy of people who had just seen something they did not want to think about too carefully. Cade stepped out of the pod, collected his rifle, and walked back to his bunk without saying a single word. Nava had been watching from the back of the crowd, and she noticed something the others had missed. Cade's expression during the wave scenario had not been excited or competitive or proud. It had been the expression of a man running a calculation, testing a theory, confirming something he already suspected. He had not been showing off, he had been calibrating. Planetfall came 16 hours later. The resolute wind descended through a thick atmosphere that burned orange against the hull, and the strike force deployed into a landscape unlike anything Cade had seen before. The surface of the colony world was covered in bioluminescent fungal forests, towering stalks of pale blue and green that pulsed with soft light, casting the entire terrain in an eerie glow that made shadows dance and distances impossible to judge by eye. Fireteam Kesh moved out on a 12-kilometer march toward the colony, and Cade kept pace with the group despite carrying nearly twice the weight of any other soldier. His ammunition was physical mass, hundreds of brass cartridges packed into heavy magazines, while the aliens carried energy cells that weighed almost nothing. Druck noticed this about 4 kilometers in and looked back at Cade with something that was not quite respect, but was at least a grudging acknowledgement. "You are strong for your size, human," he said, and it was the first thing any member of the fire team had said to Cade that was not an insult. "Thanks," Cade said and kept walking. 6 kilometers in, the point scouts detected movement. Viz raised one of her 4 hands and the column froze, every soldier dropping to a low crouch among the glowing fungal stalks. A Vraxi scout patrol emerged from the tree line ahead, 12 drones, each the size of a large dog, with dark chitinous armor plating and blade-like appendages that clicked and scraped against each other as they moved in a loose swarm pattern. Thyron gave the signal and the fire team opened fire. Plasma lances lit up the forest with bright streaks of superheated energy, and the drones dropped one by one, screeching as they fell. It was over in seconds, clean, efficient, professional, and the fire team moved on without breaking stride. But Cade had watched the engagement with different eyes than everyone else. He had seen the plasma bolts hit the Vraxi carapaces, and he had seen something that troubled him. The first bolt on each drone did not punch through cleanly but instead splashed and scattered across the surface, leaving a scorch mark but not a kill, and it took 2 or sometimes 3 shots to bring each drone down. The carapace was ablating the plasma, absorbing and dissipating the energy across its surface, the way a heat shield absorbs re-entry friction. And while 3 shots per drone was not a problem against 12 targets, it was going to be a very serious problem against 40,000. Cade said nothing about this to anyone, not yet, but that night, when the strike force made camp in a clearing among the fungal towers, he sat under the pale blue glow and did something that drew curious stares from every alien who walked past. He was hand-loading ammunition, sitting cross-legged on the ground with a small toolkit spread before him, carefully pulling apart standard rounds and replacing the tips with hardened penetrators fashioned from scraps of colony metal he had collected during the march. Nava approached after watching him for nearly an hour and crouched beside him, with the careful posture of someone approaching a wild animal. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making better bullets," Cade said without looking up. "Why?" she pressed. "Your weapon already fires projectiles. What difference does the shape of the tip make?" Cade held up one of the modified rounds, a sleek, sharp-pointed thing that gleamed dull silver in the bioluminescent light. The Vraxi carapace is designed to dissipate energy. It spreads heat across the surface, so plasma cannot burn through on the first hit. That is very smart armor against energy weapons. He turned the round slowly between his fingers, but it has never met a tungsten core slug traveling at 900 meters per second. Energy dissipation does not work against something that is not energy. This is just a piece of metal, and it does not care how good your armor is at spreading heat because it is not hot. It is just very, very fast and very, very hard. Nava stared at the round and then at Cade, and for the first time she felt something shift in her understanding of this quiet, strange, battered human. He was not stubborn and he was not stupid. He was something much more dangerous than either of those things. He was a man who understood his enemy better after one skirmish than her species had after a century of fighting them. She stood and walked back to her bunk, and she lay awake for a long time thinking about what it meant to come from a planet so violent that its people had spent their entire history learning how to kill things that were bigger and stronger and faster than they were. At 0300, a long-range sensor ping shattered the quiet of the camp. Every communicator in the force screamed to life at once, and Thyron's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "All units, emergency briefing. The Vraxi are not holding position. They are moving toward us. Estimated time to contact, 6 hours. Cade was already on his feet, already packing, already loading magazines. And when the revised sensor data came through 2 minutes later, showing that the swarm was not 40,000 but somewhere closer to 120,000, Cade did not panic and he did not curse. He simply reached for his second duffel bag, the heavy one, the one nobody had been allowed to touch, and he held it close like a man holding a promise he had made to himself a long time ago. The valley was 2 kilometers east of the colony, a narrow cut through dark stone ridges where a dry riverbed carved a path roughly 100 meters wide between steep walls that rose 30 meters on either side. It was the only natural choke point between the swarm and the strike force, and Commander Thyron chose it without hesitation as the place to make their stand. Coalition engineers worked fast in the pale glow of the fungal forests. Plasma emplacements were bolted to prefabricated mounts. Energy shield generators were staked into the rocky ground in overlapping arcs, and firing positions were carved into the valley floor with the precision of soldiers who had been trained in defensive doctrine since the day they enlisted. It was textbook, clean lines, overlapping fields of fire, layered barriers designed to channel the enemy into kill zones, where concentrated plasma fire would cut them apart wave after wave after wave. Thyron stood at the center of the line and surveyed his work with the quiet satisfaction of an officer who trusted his training and his technology and his soldiers. And when he turned to address the assembled fire team leaders, his voice carried the steady confidence of someone who believed the math was on his side. 600 coalition soldiers with the most advanced directed energy weapons in the galaxy, holding a fortified choke point against an enemy with no ranged capability and no tactical intelligence. It should have been a simple equation. Cade stood at the back of the briefing group and said nothing for a long time. He studied the defensive line, the placement of the emplacements, the angle of the shield generators, and the width of the valley floor, and he ran numbers in his head that no one else in the group would have thought to run, because no one else had grown up on a planet where wars were fought in places like this for thousands of years. When Thyron finished the briefing and asked for questions, Cade raised his hand. "Commander," he said, and every head turned because the human almost never spoke, "this line is going to fail." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Thyron's silver-blue scales tightened against his neck, a sign of anger in the Elari that most humans would have missed, but Cade had done his homework. "Explain yourself, Sergeant." "Plasma emplacements generate enormous heat when firing at sustained rates," Cade said, his voice flat and calm. "Against a swarm this size you will need continuous fire for at least 30 to 40 minutes, and your emplacements will hit thermal overload in 15, maybe 20. The safeties will kick in automatically, and your rate of fire will drop by half, then by 3/4. And then you will have 600 soldiers, with sidearms trying to hold back 100,000 drones in an open valley." He paused and looked at the energy shields. The shields are designed to stop energy-based attacks, plasma bolts, particle beams, radiation bursts. But the Vraxi do not use ranged weapons. They throw their bodies against the barrier, and every body that hits the shield drains physical energy from the generator. With the numbers we are looking at, your shields will collapse in under 10 minutes. Thyron stared at Cade for a long, cold moment. "Humans have fought exactly one galactic engagement," he said, each word sharp and deliberate. "You have been in space for less than 200 years. Do not presume to lecture me on coalition defensive doctrine. Sit down, Sergeant." Cade held Thyron's gaze for one heartbeat, then two, and then he nodded and stepped back without another word. He did not argue. He had said what needed to be said, and the fact that Thyron would not listen was not something Cade could fix with more words. But he could fix it with work. He found Druck 20 minutes later at the Gorvon heavy weapons staging area, where the massive alien was checking the charge on his plasma cannon with the careful attention of a soldier who loved his weapon the way some people love their children. "Druck," Cade said, I need to ask you something." Druck looked down at him, which required looking a very long way down, and grunted in a way that meant he was listening. "Have you ever heard of a concept called enfilade fire?" Cade asked. Druck had not. The word did not translate into any coalition military language, because the concept did not exist in coalition military doctrine. Cade explained it in simple terms. Instead of placing all your weapons in a line facing the enemy head-on, you place some of them on the flanks, angled inward, so that the streams of fire cross each other in the middle of the kill zone. Every round that misses one target has a chance of hitting the one behind it or beside it, and the enemy cannot advance in any direction without walking into fire from multiple angles. It was ancient human doctrine, developed on Earth thousands of years ago by armies that fought in narrow passes and river crossings against enemies that outnumbered them badly. And it worked because it turned the enemy's greatest strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness. Druck listened with the expression of someone hearing a new idea for the first time, and not being entirely sure whether it was brilliant or insane. "You want to put guns on the ridge," Druck said slowly, looking up at the steep valley walls. "I want to put guns where they will do the most damage," Cade said, "and that is not in a straight line on the valley floor." Druck was quiet for a moment. Then he called over two other Gorvan heavy weapons specialists, Tor and Balk, both of whom were almost as large as Druck and carried plasma cannons that looked like they had been built to destroy buildings. "Show them," Druck said to Cade. Cade drew a quick diagram in the dust with his boot, the valley floor in the center, the ridgeline on both sides, and crossing lines of fire that overlapped in a diamond pattern across the narrowest point of the choke point. The Gorvans studied it. They were not stupid soldiers, and they understood immediately what Cade was proposing, even if it violated everything they had been taught. "Thyron will not approve this," Tor said. "I am not going to ask him," Cade replied. There was a long pause. Then Druck let out a low, rumbling laugh that shook the ground under Cade's feet. "I am starting to like you, human." They climbed the eastern ridge in the dark, hauling equipment up a steep path that would have been difficult for humans but was merely annoying for Gorvans, and they set up a secondary firing position on a flat shelf of rock that overlooked the entire valley floor at an angle of roughly 30 degrees. It was here, with the sound of the swarm already beginning to vibrate through the stone beneath their feet, that Cade finally opened the second duffel bag. He had carried it across the base on Verath 4, through the barracks of the Resolute Wind, across 12 kilometers of alien forest, and up the side of a rock ridge without ever letting anyone else touch it. And the Gorvans watched with genuine curiosity as he unzipped the heavy ballistic cloth and began pulling out components. A receiver housing black steel, heavy and brutal. 6 barrels, each one thick as a human forearm, designed to rotate around a central axis. A motor assembly, electric, compact, powerful enough to spin those 6 barrels at a speed that the Gorvans could not yet comprehend. An ammunition feed system, belts of brass cartridges, each one tipped with the same tungsten core penetrators Cade had been modifying by hand in the camp. Packed in long boxes that together weighed more than Cade himself. He assembled the weapon with the same focused silence he brought to everything, each piece locking into the next with heavy mechanical clicks that echoed off the valley walls. And when he was finished, he stood back and let the Gorvan see what he had built. It was not elegant. It was not sleek or polished or humming with contained energy. It was a squat, ugly, 6-barreled monster of black steel and brass that sat on a tripod mount like some ancient beast of war dragged screaming out of a museum and into the present. Druck stared at it for a very long time. "What," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "is that?" Cade grabbed the first belt of ammunition, 5,000 rounds, and fed it into the tray with a metallic rattle that seemed to go on forever. "This is an M134X rotary minigun," he said, 6 barrels, electrically driven, chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm, cyclic rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. The numbers meant nothing to Druck, so Cade translated. "It fires 100 bullets every second," he said, "each one a tungsten core penetrator traveling at 900 meters per second. It does not overheat because the barrels rotate, and each one gets a fraction of a second to cool between shots. It does not need an energy cell because it runs on a battery and chemical propellant. And it does not stop firing until I tell it to stop or until the ammunition runs out." He looked at Druck and the 2 other Gorvons who were standing very still with very wide eyes. "This is what humans built when we wanted something dead and did not care about being elegant." The ground shook, a deep, rhythmic tremor that pulsed up through the rock like a heartbeat, and across the valley, the bioluminescent fungi began to go dark, their pale light winking out in a spreading wave that moved from the far end of the valley toward them like a shadow consuming the world. The swarm was coming. Cade placed his hands on the weapon and waited, and on the valley floor below, 600 coalition soldiers checked their plasma lances and their energy shields, and told themselves that the math was on their side. But the math had changed, and nobody had told them yet. The first wave came out of the darkness like a living flood, a wall of chitinous bodies pouring through the far end of the valley in a screeching, clicking, endless tide that swallowed the ground and filled the air with a sound like 1,000 machines, grinding against each other at once. The Vraxi drones moved fast, faster than the briefing videos had shown, faster than the simulations had predicted. Each one the size of a large dog with 6 blade-tipped legs and a carapace of dark armor that gleamed like wet obsidian in the dim glow of the dying fungi. There were thousands in the first wave alone, packed so tightly together that the valley floor disappeared beneath them. And behind the first wave came the second, and behind the second came the third, and behind the third came a darkness so deep and so thick with bodies that it looked like the earth itself was rising up and rushing forward. Commander Thyron stood behind the main defensive line and gave the order to fire. The valley erupted in light. Plasma emplacements roared to life, sending brilliant streaks of superheated energy screaming across the valley floor and into the oncoming swarm. The first bolts hit the leading edge of the wave, and the effect was devastating. Drones bursting apart in flashes of white heat, carapaces cracking and melting, bodies tumbling and crashing into the ones behind them. The soldiers cheered. This was what they had trained for, what their weapons were built for, and the kill count climbed with every second as the plasma fire tore into the swarm like a blade through water. But water fills the gap where the blade passes, and the swarm did the same. For every drone that fell, 3 more surged over its body and kept coming, and the wave did not slow and did not stop and did not hesitate because the Vraxi did not think of their dead as losses. They thought of them as ground gained. Thyron watched the numbers on his tactical display and felt something cold begin to creep into his chest. The kill rate was high, impressively high, but the swarm was not shrinking. It was absorbing the casualties the way an ocean absorbs rain, and it kept coming. 12 minutes into the engagement, the first plasma emplacement went into thermal overload. A sharp warning tone followed by the whine of cooling systems kicking in, and the weapon's rate of fire dropped by half as automatic safeties prevented the containment chamber from rupturing. 30 seconds later, a second emplacement overloaded, then a third. Cade had given them 20 minutes. He had been generous. The energy shields were the next to fail. The front line of Vraxi drones did not try to go around the shields or find gaps in the coverage. They simply threw themselves against the barriers, body after body after body, each impact draining energy from the generators, and the shields flickered and dimmed like candle flames in a storm. When the first shield collapsed, the sound it made was a soft, anticlimactic hum, almost gentle, And then there was nothing between the swarm and the soldiers behind it except 30 meters of open ground. Panic hit the line like a physical force. Not the kind of panic that makes soldiers scream, but the quiet, devastating kind that makes them hesitate for half a second before pulling the trigger. That makes their shots go wide. That makes them take one step backward without realizing they are doing it. Thyron shouted orders: fall back to secondary positions, regroup, maintain fire discipline. And his soldiers obeyed because they were professionals. But their eyes were wide and their hands were shaking. And everyone on that line understood the same terrible truth at the same moment. They were losing. Then from the ridge above, a sound. It was not a sound any alien in that valley had ever heard. Not in war, not in training, not in any simulation or recording or historical archive. Because it was a sound that belonged to another world and another time, a sound that the galaxy had forgotten existed. It began as a mechanical whine, an electric motor spinning up, followed by a heavy metallic clicking, as 6 barrels began to rotate around a central axis, slowly at first, then faster still until the individual barrels blurred into a single dark circle. And then the M134X Hellstorm opened its mouth, and the valley learned what human violence sounds like. The noise was not a series of shots. It was a single continuous roar, a ripping, tearing, thundering scream of sound that hit the eardrums like a physical blow and echoed off the valley walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A sound so deep and so loud, and so impossibly fast that several coalition soldiers ducked reflexively, believing for one terrible instant that the ridge itself was collapsing. Cade held the weapon steady and pressed the trigger, and 100 tungsten core rounds per second poured out of those spinning barrels, and down into the valley floor like a river of metal falling from the sky. The effect on the swarm was beyond anything the coalition soldiers had ever witnessed. The tungsten penetrators did not splash against the Vraxi carapace the way plasma bolts did. They did not spread their energy across the surface, or get absorbed or deflected. They hit the armor at 900 meters per second and went straight through it like it was not there, punching clean holes through the first drone and continuing into the second, and sometimes the third before they finally spent their energy and stopped. The stream of fire was so dense and so fast that it created a visible wall of destruction across the valley floor, a line of shredding, splintering, shattering violence that moved wherever Cade pointed the weapon, and everything it touched came apart. Drones were not just killed, they were destroyed, ripped into fragments of chitin and fluid that sprayed into the air and coated the ground in a dark slick, and the drones behind them ran into the same wall of metal and were destroyed in turn, and behind them came more who met the same fate. And for the first time in the recorded history of any species that had ever fought the Vraxi, the swarm did something nobody believed was possible. It hesitated. The front edge of the wave slowed, not by much, not for long, but enough for every soldier on the valley floor to see it happen. And a ripple of confusion passed through the swarm like a shudder through a single massive body that had just encountered something it did not understand. The Vraxi had fought energy weapons for 10,000 years. Their carapace had evolved to dissipate heat. Their swarm tactics had been refined to overwhelm shield barriers. Their entire biology was optimized to survive and overcome the kind of warfare the galaxy had practiced since before humanity learned to make fire. But this was not energy. This was mass, raw and brutal and screaming, and they had no answer for it because they had never needed one. On the ridge, Cade fed the second belt of ammunition into the weapon, 5,000 more rounds, and kept firing, sweeping the stream of metal across the valley in long arcs that cut through the swarm like a scythe through tall grass. Druck stood beside him and watched with his mouth open and his plasma cannon hanging forgotten at his side. Then something clicked in the big Gorvon's mind, and he remembered what Cade had taught him about enfilade fire, about crossing angles, about turning the enemy's numbers against them. Druck raised his plasma cannon and repositioned to the left side of the ridge, not firing straight down into the swarm, but angling his shots to cross Cade's line of fire at a 30-degree angle, so that the plasma bolts caught drones that were trying to spread out to avoid the Gatling gun's kill zone. Tor and Balk saw what Druck was doing and followed without being told. They set up on the right side of the ridge and angled their fire inward. And suddenly, the valley floor was caught in a crossfire pattern that left no safe direction for the swarm to move. The diamond of death that Cade had drawn in the dust with his boot the night before was now real, written in fire and metal and plasma across the valley floor, and everything inside that diamond was dying. On the main line below, Thyron watched the carnage with an expression that shifted from shock to disbelief to something that looked almost like awe. The tactical display on his wrist showed the kill rate climbing at a speed he had never seen in any battle, any simulation, any war game he had ever participated in. Nava was broadcasting the engagement feed directly to Coalition High Command. Her hands were shaking, but her training held, and she made sure every second of data was captured because she understood, even in the chaos and noise and terror of the moment, that what was happening on that ridge was going to change the way the galaxy thought about war. The second wave of the swarm hit the crossfire zone and broke apart like water hitting a wall, drones piling up on top of drones, climbing over mounds of their own dead, only to be cut down by the endless stream of tungsten rounds that showed no sign of slowing. The third wave never made it past the halfway point of the valley. Cade was drenched in sweat. The weapon vibrated in his grip with a force that would have shaken a lesser man apart, and the heat coming off the rotating barrels turned the air around him into a shimmering haze that made the valley below look like a painting melting in the sun. But the barrels kept spinning, because that was the genius of the design, each barrel firing only once per revolution and spending the rest of the cycle cooling down, so that the weapon could sustain a rate of fire that would have destroyed any single-barrel gun in seconds. He fired belt after belt, 5,000 rounds, 10,000, 20,000, and each belt was fed by Druck's massive hands because the Gorvon had appointed himself as Cade's loader without being asked, and was keeping the ammunition flowing with the kind of fierce determination that comes from a soldier who has found something worth believing in. The swarm's advance stalled, then it fractured. Then it began to collapse inward on itself as the rear elements tried to push forward while the front elements tried to retreat, and the result was a churning mass of bodies trapped in the kill zone with nowhere to go. Thyron saw the opening and seized it. All units advance, push forward, drive them back. And 600 coalition soldiers surged forward with renewed fury, their plasma lances blazing, their fear replaced by a savage energy that surprised even them. The battle lasted 90 minutes from the first shot to the last, and when it was over, the valley floor was covered in a carpet of shattered carapace and dark fluid that stretched from wall to wall for nearly half a kilometer. The Gatling guns' barrels glowed cherry red in the dim light, ticking softly as they cooled, and thin wisps of smoke curled up from the feed mechanism like the last breaths of something that had just finished a very long and very violent conversation. Cade's hands were blistered and raw, his ears were ringing so badly that the world had gone quiet and cottony, and his face was streaked with grime and sweat, and something dark that might have been his own blood from where a piece of flying carapace had cut his cheek. He had fired over 150,000 rounds in 90 minutes. Druck stood beside him, staring down at the valley floor, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then Druck turned and looked at the glowing weapon, and then at the human standing next to it, and his voice was very quiet when he finally asked, "How long has your species had these?" Cade wiped his face with the back of one ruined hand and looked out at the valley full of dead things, and gave an answer that Druck would remember for the rest of his life. "About 400 years. We stopped using them because we built things that were worse." Druk said nothing for a very long time after that. The colony was retaken 2 days after the battle, and it fell so easily that it almost felt like an afterthought. The Vraxi swarm had lost over 80,000 drones in the valley, and what remained had scattered into the deep tunnels beneath the surface, with the mindless desperation of a hive that had lost its will to fight. Coalition soldiers moved through the abandoned streets of the colony in careful formation, clearing buildings that were already empty, securing infrastructure that the Vraxi had not even bothered to destroy on their way out. And everywhere they went they found the same thing, which was nothing at all, because the enemy that had terrified the entire sector for months had broken apart in a single night in a narrow valley on a moon that most of the galaxy could not find on a star chart. The casualty report came in that evening. Coalition losses were 47 soldiers killed and 112 wounded, a fraction of the projected figures, and most of those casualties had occurred in the first 15 minutes of the engagement before the secondary firing position on the ridge had turned the battle around. Thyron filed his after-action report in the command tent with the careful, measured language of an officer who understood that what he wrote would be read by people far above his rank. But there was a line in the report that stood out from the rest, a single sentence that would be quoted in military academies across the coalition for decades to come. The decisive factor in the engagement was the deployment of a kinetic projectile weapon system operated by Sergeant Elias Cade of Earth's Colonial Marine Corps, the capabilities of which exceeded all projections and exploited a fundamental vulnerability in Vraxi biological armor that directed-energy weapons could not. It was the most generous thing Thyron had ever written about anyone, and it was the closest he had ever come to admitting he had been wrong. He found Cade that evening at the edge of the colony perimeter, sitting on an overturned supply crate with his bolt-action rifle across his knees, cleaning it with the same worn cloth he always used. Not the Gatling gun, which was packed away in its case, but the old rifle, the one everyone had laughed at. Thyron stood in front of him for a long moment without speaking, the Alori officer who had dismissed the human on the first day, who had told him to sit down and stop presuming to understand warfare, who had placed his trust in doctrine and technology, and the certainty that 1,000 years of coalition military tradition could not be improved upon by a species that had been in space for less than 2 centuries. "Sergeant," Thyron said. Cade looked up. His face was tired. His hands were wrapped in medicated bandages where the blisters had been treated by Nava, and his eyes had the faraway look of a man who had seen something loud and terrible and was still hearing echoes of it in the quiet. "Commander," Cade replied. Thyron did something that Cade had not expected. He placed his right hand over his chest, fingers spread wide, and lowered his head in a gesture that Cade recognized from the cultural briefing as a formal Alori apology, the kind that was offered between equals when a genuine wrong had been done. "I was wrong about you," Thyron said, "and I was wrong about your weapon, and I was wrong about your species. I underestimated all 3. And my soldiers nearly paid the price for my arrogance." Cade held Thyron's gaze and nodded, not a big nod, not a dramatic gesture, just a small dip of the head that said he accepted the apology without needing to make a moment out of it. "Your soldiers fought well," Cade said. "They held that line longer than most would have. They held it because someone on a ridge gave them a reason to believe they could," Thyron replied. Then he turned and walked away, and that was the end of it. No speeches, no ceremony, no grand declarations, just 2 soldiers who understood each other a little better than they had before. Nava's report reached Coalition High Command within hours of being filed, and it detonated like a bomb in every military planning office across the Central Worlds. It was not just a medical report. It was a comprehensive tactical analysis that included full telemetry data from the Gatling gun's operation, ballistic performance metrics showing the tungsten penetrators achieving over 90% first-hit kills against Vraxi carapace, compared to 33% for plasma lances. Thermal sustainability data showing the rotary weapon maintaining full rate of fire for the entire engagement without a single overheat event. And a cost analysis showing that the raw materials for Cade's ammunition were cheaper than a single plasma energy cell by a factor of several hundred. But it was the addendum at the end of the report that kept Coalition admirals awake at night, a personal note from Nava that read, "The weapon designated M134X is considered by Sergeant Cade to be an obsolete, mid-tier armament by Earth standards. When asked during a post-engagement interview what humanity's current apex weapons were, the sergeant declined to answer, stating the information was classified. His vital signs during this exchange indicated no deception. He was not lying about the classification, however. His biometric data showed elevated cortisol and controlled breathing consistent with a protective emotional response. In my professional medical opinion, the sergeant was not withholding information to gain an advantage. He was withholding it because he believed the knowledge itself would cause harm. He was protecting us." The political aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. Humanity's provisional membership status, which had been expected to remain in place for at least another 50 years, was fast-tracked through the Coalition Council in less than a month. And when the vote came, it was nearly unanimous. But Nava knew, and Thyron knew, and everyone who had been in that valley knew, that the vote was not driven by admiration. It was driven by a quiet, creeping, deeply uncomfortable realization about what humanity actually was. The galaxy had looked at humans and seen primitives, small, fragile creatures from a violent little planet who had barely mastered spaceflight and still used chemical propellants and ballistic weapons like cavemen banging rocks together. But the Battle of Verath Valley had pulled back the curtain, and behind it was something that the Coalition had never encountered in 10,000 years of galactic civilization. Humans were not primitive, they were specialized. They were a species forged in the fire of a world so hostile and so competitive that they had spent their entire evolutionary history developing increasingly efficient methods of destruction, not because they were cruel, but because their survival had demanded it at every single step. They had invented the spear and the bow and the sword and the crossbow and the cannon and the rifle and the machine gun and the tank and the bomber and the nuclear warhead and the orbital strike platform, and each one had been built to solve the same problem. Something is trying to kill us. How do we kill it first? And how do we do it faster and harder and from further away than the last time? And each time they solved the problem, they did not stop. They kept building, kept refining, kept inventing, because on Earth the problem never went away, because on Earth the most dangerous predator was always another human. A Coalition military historian named Salith contacted Cade 3 weeks after the battle for a recorded interview, and she asked him to explain the progression of human military technology in simple terms. She was writing a strategic assessment for the Council, and she needed primary source testimony. Cade thought for a moment and then explained. He started with stone tools and worked his way forward through bronze and iron and steel, through gunpowder and rifling and automatic weapons, through armored vehicles and aircraft and submarines and missiles, through nuclear fission and fusion, and the theoretical weapons platforms that were developed during the Cold War, an era when two human nations pointed enough destructive power at each other to render their entire planet uninhabitable several times over. Not as a last resort, but as a first-line deterrent. Salith listened to all of this with the careful attention of an academic, but her face had grown progressively paler as the interview continued, and when Cade finished, she sat in silence for nearly a full minute before asking one last question. "How many of these wars," she said carefully, "were fought against other species?" Cade looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "None," he said. "Every single one was against ourselves. We only stopped when we came out here and found other things to protect." Salith ended the interview shortly after that and filed her assessment with a classification level that Cade never learned. But the Coalition Council read it, and the fast-tracking of human membership was approved the following week, and nobody ever called humanity primitive again. On the transport back to Coalition space, the Resolute wind was quieter than it had been on the way out. The soldiers were tired and healing and processing what they had seen, and the easy laughter and casual confidence of the outbound journey had been replaced by something more sober and more thoughtful. Cade sat in his bunk and cleaned his rifle, the old one, the bolt-action, the museum piece. And he did it the same way he always did, with steady hands and a worn cloth, and the quiet focus of a man performing a ritual that was older than the stars outside his window. Druk sat on the deck beside him, too large for the human-sized bunks, his back against the bulkhead and his massive legs stretched out across the floor. And he sat there in silence, because somewhere over the past 2 weeks the distance between them had closed, and the Gorvon who had laughed at the human's fire stick now chose to spend his off hours in the company of the man who carried it. Other soldiers passed through the barracks and glanced at Cade as they went, Alori and Selith and Gorvon, and a dozen other species, and the looks they gave him were different now than they had been before the battle. Not contempt, not amusement, not the polite condescension of advanced civilizations looking down at a newcomer who did not yet understand how the galaxy worked. It was respect, genuine and hard-earned and tinged with just the faintest edge of something sharper, something that came from understanding for the first time that this quiet, battered, unremarkable-looking human was carrying the legacy of a species that had spent 200,000 years learning how to fight and win against everything their world could throw at them, and then against each other, and then against anything else that was foolish enough to stand in their way. Cade finished cleaning the rifle, checked the action one final time, chambered a round out of pure habit, and leaned back against the wall with his eyes closed. Somewhere in his duffel, packed carefully in ballistic cloth and gun grease, the Gatling gun sat cooling in its case. 6 barrels, 6,000 rounds per minute, 400 years old in concept, and still more effective against the galaxy's most feared enemy than anything the Coalition had built in a millennium of trying. A relic of old Earth, a museum piece, a fire stick. The most dangerous museum piece in the galaxy. And humanity had stopped using them because they built things that were worse, and the galaxy was only just beginning to understand what that meant.